If you've got your Bibles, please turn with me, not to the text of my message, but to the backdrop of a message I want to bring to you. John chapter 2, and I'm going to read the miracle of Cana in Galilee, and that was Jesus' miracle of the conversion of water into wine. I'm going to use that as a backdrop, read for you a few words, and then enter into the message. And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, They have no wine. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. That wooden translation reads too pungently. What Jesus is really saying to her is, Woman, I don't think you really understand the timetable under which I am operating. And it is interesting that he went ahead and performed the miracle anyway, almost as if to say that I am operating on a timetable that God wants me to operate. When his brother said to him, Are you going to come to the Passover? He said, Not yet. And a few moments later he went. Jesus was moving in a certain time span, and when the fullness of time was come, he was born into this world. So he was listening to a different drummer. Verse 5, His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firskins apiece. Jesus saith unto them, Fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bare it. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom. And he saith unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until the last. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. It is fascinating to read this passage of Scripture 2,000 years ago, and then to read a letter to the editor after the Jim Jones saga in Guyana. You remember what happened. It is one of the most hellish things ever perpetrated upon man, where this one individual with a messianic complex proclaimed himself to be the Messiah of these several hundred people. And I have 2 cassettes in my study. As a matter of fact, in the light of the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, those tapes were available. And it is the live conversation on the last day when Jim Jones finally orchestrated that mass suicide. May I say this to you, keenly aware of the words I am using. I have never on tape ever heard anything more hellish than those 2 tapes. It is one of the worst things I've ever heard, when the man in all kinds of trances moves into profanity in a voice that almost sounds unearthly and much more hellish than anything else. And he screamed out at those people whom he by now had filled with fright. One man was literally begging him to let him go, and Jones refused to at the threat of a gun. These are the last 2 or 3 paragraphs. Let me read excerpts for you. Jim Jones is screaming in hysteria at this point, and he says, Let's get gone. We tried to find a new beginning, but it's too late. Lay down your lives with dignity. Don't lay them down with tears and agony. And the crying and hysteria is building to a crescendo in the background. Stop this hysteria. It's just something to put you to rest. Keep your emotions down, children. It will not hurt if you keep quiet. I don't care how many screams you hear. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable than to spend more days in this life. I call on you to quit exciting your children, mothers. Stop this nonsense. Hurry, my children, hurry. Quickly, quickly. No more pain, no more pain. All you do is take a drink and go to sleep. Have trust in me. You have to step across. This world is not my home. And in the words of one commentator, and so ended the symphony that he conducted, orchestrating the death of nearly 1,000 men, women, and children. Probably the most irrational letter to the editor in the Time magazine after the Guyana incident read this way: I do not know why the Christians are so upset with what Jim Jones did. Did Jesus do anything different to Jones? Jones claimed to be the Messiah, elicited a following. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, elicited a following. I don't see any difference between the two, and the last ones who ought to be complaining ought to be the Christian folk. You know, in philosophy, you take a course that is called a formal and a fundamental fallacy in logic, and there are many, many formal fallacies. One of them is this: just because two things have one thing in common does not necessarily mean they have everything in common. My brother has ears, elephants have ears, therefore my brother is an elephant. You see, that's the logic. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, Jones claimed to be the Messiah, therefore they both are the same. Gandhi was a political leader, Hitler was a political leader, therefore they are the same. Charles Manson seeks a following, Mother Teresa seeks a following, therefore they both are the same. It is only the individual who has not looked at the Bible with an honest heart who is the one who has rejected the Messiah. When I go in to listen to students on university campuses ask their questions, most often they can't even ask meaningful biblical questions because many of them have never read it. They have read about it, they have an opinion on it, they have never really read it. And I want to present to you the message entitled, Jesus as They Saw Him. I want to look at the life of Jesus in three different categories. It was the physicist Helmholtz who said, if you want to understand the nature of the eye, you must understand the properties of light. If you want to understand the nature of the eye, you must understand the properties of light. And the other day I was sitting thinking about this whole business of how people view things differently, and I came to the conclusion our biggest problem is that we look at life with our eyes rather than through our eyes. We look at life with our eyes rather than through our eyes. The eye is the instrument to see, not the instrument to define value. The definition of value comes elsewhere. You look into the mirror, but you go to the faucet to wash your face. And what we very often do is look with our eyes and define with our eyes, and hence the term materialist. We define ourselves as material beings from beginning to end. I want to look at Jesus from three vantage points. And if you don't know him personally, please do yourself a favor. Please do yourself a favor. Try and reject my style. Try to blind yourself to the approach I am taking. Only try and weigh out whether what I'm saying to you makes sense or not. So often we reject a message because we want to reject the messenger. If you can somehow do it, I want you only to hear the message, and I want you to see what it is I'm trying to say to you. The first aspect of Jesus' life, I want to see him in the essential nature of his person. The essential nature of his person. Who was he in essence? Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, who has made existentialism very, very popular. What does existentialism really mean? Existentialism, if defined philosophically, sounds more confusing. So let me define it most rigorously so nobody knocks me for it, and then popularize the definition. Where it really says existence precedes essence, what it means is what I do determines who I am. What I do determines who I am. In other words, the Word of God tells me to behave a certain way because of who I am. Existentialism reverses it and says, on the basis of what you do, you can define who you are. So you see, if I want to define life a certain way, I act a certain way. And it has really got the definition the wrong way around. Jesus' essence was the fact that he claimed to be the Son of God, claimed to be equal with God. And I want you to see him in two thoughts there. In the essential nature of his person, number one, he was perfect in purity. Number one, he was perfect in purity. If I were to ask, would you please write a definition of purity? I think you'll have a very difficult time. The reason for that is this. It's the same way if I said to you, could you please define nothing? You cannot define nothing because nothing by definition partakes of something. When you use the word nothing, you're really saying no thing. And so nothing is defined as the absence of something. And that is exactly the problem we have with the word purity too. If I say to you, I am a pure individual, you will go away assuming there are some things he doesn't do, there are some places he doesn't go, there are some thoughts he doesn't think, there are some habits he doesn't espouse. You will define my purity in terms of the absence of something, and legitimately so. Let me have you focus your attention on this scene. There's a man living on top of Mount Tabor in the mind of this particular writer, using his imagination, and the man is calling himself Elion. He pretends to be a hermit living at the top of Mount Tabor. And he says, as hermits, we are accustomed to seeing visions and dreaming dreams. He says, but when I woke up this morning, I was going to see something that was not a vision, that was not a dream. It was something that jolted me into reality. I was standing behind the tree this morning when 4 individuals, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, began to quietly make their way up to the top of the mount. For those of you, ladies and gentlemen, who've been to Israel, you will agree with me that the top of Mount Tabor is one of the most beautiful settings in Israel. Topographically, it is striking. You stand on top of the mountain and you look in one direction, you see the sprawling valleys of Megiddo. You look in another direction, on a clear day, you'll see the spires of Nazareth. You look in a third direction, you'll see the calm and the lovely waters of the Sea of Galilee. You turn around and you look at the fourth direction, you see the tender and the gentle curves of Mount Hermon, snow-capped for so much of the year. And as you look around all of this, and a quiet cathedral stands atop Mount Tabor today, I was picturing with this man, imagining himself to be Elion, what really happened. Jesus, Peter, James, and John, gently making their way to the top of the mountain, and Elion is watching them. He says Jesus was talking to them, instructing them in many ways. Then Jesus left the 3 disciples, moved to the top of the mount all by himself. And he says, all of a sudden, the body of Jesus began to glow with an incandescent radiance, a whiter white the human mind could not conceive. And as the body began to glow whiter and whiter and whiter, suddenly the heavens were rent in two, and I saw 2 figures descending into the presence of Jesus. And I had barely enough strength and breath in my body to cry out the names of Moses and Elijah. But no more had these 2 men descended when I fell prostrate onto the dust of Tabor. All I had seen was Moses and Elijah descending, Jesus' body beginning to glow, and as I fell face down into the dust of the earth, suddenly I heard the voice of Almighty God reverberating through the valleys below, crying out, "This is my Son, listen to him." When I think of Jesus, ladies and gentlemen, I think of that transfiguration scene. And if I were Peter, I would have done exactly what he did with Jesus. And many times I feel that way. Turning on a television program for a few moments, watching a fellow being interviewed, mentioning the name of God. I said, who is this fellow? And then he starts talking about the reason most people fear death is because the Christians have caused that fear. He says, I don't believe in any of that. I'm not a humanist, I'm a deist. Those are the kinds of boys I'd love to take on in a debate, who only know how to slam something, never know how to defend theirs, who only know how to break eggs, they never know what to do with them. Slam, slam, slam. Jesus again to blame, Christianity again to blame. Blame everybody, you see, but don't blame ourselves. And he said, and the problem with Christianity is they have infused a morality into this world that is more condemnatory than exaltative. And then he goes on to say this. He says, and that is terribly selfish. Who told him that? And if it is selfish, is that good or bad? When you see this, when you hear this, when you travel around and hear of the broken homes, see the young children with no homes to go to, think of the broken dreams, broken lives, think of all of these places where political ideologies are destroying human life, somehow you pine within your soul the way Peter pined within his soul when he said to Jesus, let's stay here. Let's stay here. I don't want to go down from this mountain again. And the reason was, Peter was privileged to see the transfiguration of our Lord. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you something. The purity of man is the absence of something. The purity of Jesus is the presence of something. You with me? The purity of man is the absence of something. The purity of Jesus is the presence of something. And many a times as I start writing, one of my chapters in the book on worship is the God whom we worship. And language becomes exhausted. Concepts become beggarly. And I find myself just desperately trying to nudge at the truth. I like what one philosopher says about the gods of the Greeks and the gods of the Mediterraneans. He says this: it is true of the Greek religions that it is not a fact that the gods abandoned the people because the people became so depraved, but the people abandoned their gods because their gods became so depraved. When you read Homer, when you read Aeschylus, when you read many of these writers, or you go on to read Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, you begin to see a kind of a plea from these thinkers. Won't you get the concept of deity at least unmingled with dirt and unmingled with impurity? How we play a game in front of other people. And I want to tell you, as soon as we behold Jesus face to face, we'll find out what purity really is. When I look at my life, I think of Augustine. And by the way, Augustine was one of the greatest minds that ever lived. And he ran and ran and ran and ran from God, till finally, through his mother, he was marvelously converted. And Augustine says this at one point: I placed myself behind myself all the time. You took me from behind myself, put me in front of myself. I saw myself and was horrified. And then he goes on to say this. I was sharing this with my daughter one day, and even she came to grips with this idea. It fascinates me how those little minds can come to grip with such profound thoughts. I was talking about Augustine this way, one of the great men of God, and I said, you know what he said once, honey? Because she was asking me a question about why there are some good people who do such bad things. And I was talking to her about Augustine, and I said, listen to me carefully now, Sari, and see if you understand what I'm saying. I said what Augustine said was that there are two kinds of loves within me. There is a love which loves the good. There is a love which loves the evil. There is the love which loves the good. There is the love which loves the evil. And Augustine says, and the best thing I can say about myself is that there is a third kind of a passion that looks at both of them. There's a third kind of a passion that looks at both of them. I have a love which loves the love that loves the good, and I have a hate which hates the love that loves the evil. Did you follow me? There's a passion looking at both of them. One loves the good, one loves the evil. And the best thing I can say about myself is that I love the love which loves the good, and I hate the love which loves the evil. And that tiny little girl says, Daddy, that's exactly the way I feel sometimes. I want to do good things, I want to do bad things. And there's something within me that hates the bad part of me. And when you look at your soul, when you look at your will, when you look at your ambitions, when you look at your goals, when you look at your dreams, things are almost never as they appear to be. Things are almost never as they appear to be. And some of you may be close to other people who haven't got the faintest clue how impure your life is. There's something wonderful about the fact that you can bring your impurity and turn your face towards the living God, because when you look at God, you're looking not at the absence of impurities, you're looking at the very presence of purity. There's a second quality about his essence. Number one, perfect in purity. Number two, he was a model in charity. He was a model in charity. I will often say this to young couples who come to me to ask some questions on future relationships, etc. I always say to them, there is never any reason to be unkind. There's never any reason to be unkind. You can be strong, you can be tough, you can be very, very severe in the things you're saying, but you don't have to be unkind in what you're saying. And I look at Jesus. I don't know how many of you have ever read of what lepers really go through. Arthur Mee, in his children's encyclopedia, describes the story of Joseph Damien, one of these missionaries who served amongst the lepers. One day some boiling hot water fell on his feet, and it took him about 30 seconds to suddenly realize he had no sensation on his foot. And as he walked up to the audience that day, all lepers sitting in front of him, he normally began with my fellow believers. Today he began his sermon with my fellow lepers, and then broke down and wept and recognized his body was now crawling with that hideous disease that was destroying him. A few years ago, I was speaking at a leprosarium at the tip of the Sahara Desert. I don't think there's more of a beleaguered-looking people than them. And I remember as the missionary was taking me through to speak in this auditorium, suddenly the missionary said, "I'll be back in just a moment," and turned around. And I was about to turn the knob of the door leading me into the auditorium, and I backed off for a moment. I didn't want to touch the knob out of fear as to whether that kind of a leprosy could spread or whatever. Illegitimate was my reaction. To my embarrassment, I remember, because I was wearing a jacket, my elbow was covered. I turned the knob and moved in that way. And then as I stood in front of these people with worn-out extremities, almost monkey-like faces and no digitals, sitting there to almost an embarrassment to their own lives and to humanity, and you see the smiles on their faces as you preach to them and so on, you can think back of Jesus' day. In the rabbinic laws, you would never come closer than 6 feet to a leper, and on a windy day, a rabbi would never come within 100 feet of a leper. You can see synagogues today in Israel where there are cubbyhole-like sections in the synagogues with doors that backed off into a different area. They were reserved for lepers to come in late and leave early. Imagine yourself one of them. People would throw money at you. Nobody would ever dream and come and talk to you in any meaningful significance to your value. No wonder they'd sit at the corners of streets and cry out for somebody to toss their alms their way. No rabbi would ever forgive himself if he stumbled over a leper. That leper would have been a man who was castigated and done away with for touching somebody as pure as a rabbi. Jesus went out to the leper, and if you read the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of touch. Jesus reached out, looked into the eyes of the leper, talked to him, and probably for the first time in memory, the leper sees somebody reaching out and touching him. Michael Green says, this was not a different kind of a man. This was a different kind of a God. I think of the whole issue of the woman with the issue of blood. 12 years she'd had it, even longer maybe. The Bible tells us that if she had seen every physician, if you read the Talmud tells you how many different kinds of cures there were. And in the Levitical laws, a woman with that kind of an ailment was an untouchable. Every piece of furniture she touched became unclean. Think again. Why did she do this? Jesus is walking through the center of town. Thronging masses are reaching out to go out and touch him. Why, in the name of reason, does an unclean woman have the courage? I strongly suspect because she believed that Jesus would never condemn her for it. She would have had to push aside people who, if they knew what her difficulty was, would have been ruthless with her physically, trying to maim the girl for having touched them. She pushes her way through the crowd, reaches out and just touches the hem of his garment. He turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And out of no fear in her heart, she looks at him and says, "Master, I did." And he says, "Daughter, great is your faith. Go back. You are well again." I believe with all my heart, Jesus' hands were amongst the most powerful aspect of his ministry. He reached out and touched somebody. My dear friend, Jesus wants to reach out and touch your life. He wants you to be picked up by him in his tenderness, take you by the hand, rise you to your feet again. He wants to reach out and put the arms of love around you to give you that significance that even a tiny little baby needs that is unable to converse linguistically. Somehow when those arms are put around that child and gradually the fidgeting stops and the body begins to relax, and within moments that child is asleep. "Come unto me," says Jesus, "all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I," says he, "will give you rest." Jesus was a preacher. The rabbis sat down and taught. Jesus stood up and preached. Jesus in Mark 1:38 says, "Let us go to the next towns that I may preach there also." He was a proclaimer. He was a student. He knew rabbinics. He knew the languages, and he would use it very, very powerfully. He had the style and the stance of a prophet. He used his tongue like a weapon to carve out people before their eyes so they can see themselves. And I like the way Jesus uses words. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a massive difference between the use of fine words and the fine use of words. There's a massive difference between the use of fine words and the fine use of words. And by the way, I believe words are more descriptive than paintings are. A good word is better than 1,000 pictures. I'll demonstrate that for you. It won't take me more than a minute. Listen. W.E. Sangster, the British preacher, he says he was at a garden party, and then he says this, "I just picked up myself a glass of punch when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this dainty but bulbous woman ballooned towards me." Can you draw that? If you do you know what you'll do? I don't know what you do. This dainty but bulbous one ballooning towards you, you will force your view of reality in one way by that picture upon me. But when Sangster says this dainty but bulbous woman ballooned towards me, my imagination goes to work, and I do with it what I choose. The picture forces me to think in one way. Listen to P.G. Wodehouse, that writer, describing his sidekick Jeeves bringing in a reluctant visitor. He says he brought in this reluctant and scrambling visitor and shoveled him into my apartment. Shoveled him in. You can't draw that. And if you think you could draw both of those, I dare you to draw this. The credit is given to Alexander Pope. Talking about the conversion of water into wine, I want to tell you this is a masterpiece. Listen. He says, "The conscious water saw its master and blushed." That beautiful? The conscious water saw its master and blushed. Words, passion, reality. Words are reflective of reality, and when the right words are used, reality is clutched at, and it changes the entire dimensions of your life. Jesus in his preaching used powerful words. He described the Pharisee. He said, "You strain at a gnat and you swallow a camel." He said, "You garnish the sepulchres of the prophets after you have stoned them." He said, "You scour the whole earth to look for one convert and then make him twicefold damnable for hell." His words were powerful, but do you know what he did in his preaching? He did two things. Jesus, as a preacher in his preaching, forced people to see themselves as God sees them. He forced people to see themselves as God sees them. Have you seen yourself as God sees you? You look out into the world today and think of all of the freedom we are pining after, all of the things we are craving after. We think of technology. Technology has freed us. I can turn a dial and enter into experiences foreign to myself. Industry has freed us. I can pick up my bags, move from one city to another, find another job. Education has freed my mind, and in some cases my conscience. Medicine has freed me from disease, and in other instances freed other people from life. Chemistry has changed us, and in some ways it has even affected our emotions. Psychiatry has set us free. You go on and on and on. And yet one writer describes us as homo perturbatus, restless man, intoxicated with a sense of freedom he has never had before. Restless man intoxicated with a sense of freedom he has never had before. Jesus shows you as you really are. And what Jesus says is this: when a man lives for himself, no matter how powerful the nations are, when a man lives to indulge and exploit and abuse his freedom, when a man thinks he has nothing good to do except live for himself, Jesus exposes that man as a liar, as a cruel, self-centered individual, and he describes you and me as those who are lost in the shackles of sin unless he himself comes to rescue us. Jesus in his preaching reveals to you who you really are, but much more than that, Jesus reveals to you who you ought to be. Jesus reveals to you who you ought to be. This is such a difficult concept, and the heart of what I want to say to you, that if you do not follow what I'm saying, I think you will miss what I think is the most important aspect of this message. In my office, there is a parchment, and where I sit behind my desk now, I can see that. It is beautifully penned. In the last year, no one quote, and I read an awful lot of them, memorize an awful lot of them. I'm talking about those outside of the Word now. No quote has wrestled in my mind more than this particular one. So many times I've said to my wife, I said, honey, one of these days that quote is going to burst forth into some truths that I have never dreamed of before. I feel I'm touching the tip of an iceberg, if only I can get to the core of what it is I'm trying to say. Please listen to me. Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. And he compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way he encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. Let me explain that to you. I was preaching in a tiny little village. in a country and in a village, better unnamed so you don't misunderstand me. They were all illiterate people sitting in front of me with smelly, dirty, unwashed clothes. There was one woman in there without one tooth inside her mouth. Her face looked so marred and scarred, and she was an elderly woman. I don't think there was a fraction of a portion of skin on her face that was unwrinkled. She'd squat there in front listening to the message every day, the simplest truths of the gospel going through an interpreter. And one evening she came and said to the interpreter, "I want to take this Jesus into my life." And then I'd see her smiling from ear to ear, night after night through the meetings. On the last day, she came to the missionary, to the interpreter, and myself. She was carrying a dirty bundle of clothes on her head, and I want to tell you, all her worldly belongings were in that tiny little dirty, smelly bundle. If you got within 2 or 3 feet of her, you could get the aroma of an unwashed body and unwashed clothing. Earrings heavy, bringing the earlobes down almost to her ears. And she came over, clutched the hand of the fellow who'd been doing the interpreting for me and says, "Would you please ask these 2 men if somebody can take a picture of me with both of them? I would greatly appreciate it." The greatest day in her life was when she found Jesus, and she said the second greatest thing is, "I want a picture with these 2 gentlemen." I have that picture at home now, brethren. That dear woman standing next to me, if it had been permitted culturally, I would have done it. I wanted desperately to reach out and put my arm around her to see that fragile bag of bones standing there, going back to a shack that probably would be washed out by the first rainfall that monsoon time. And as she stood in the middle there, and that picture was taken, and I brought it home, and that smile all across her face, I want to tell you this. If I took that picture to an average humanist, an atheist, a secularist, a pragmatist, whatever, he would look at the face of that woman, look at the personality of the woman, and say that woman is basically dead. And then I show him the picture of Bertrand Russell with all of his degrees, all of his brilliance, all of his mathematizing and philosophizing, using his brilliance to knock out the foundations of belief in God from every other person he talked to. And yet a man who lived a promiscuous lifestyle, so that even when he received his knighthood, the king said the quality of his life betrayed him an awful lot. And yet when I read his books and read his degrees and read his professorial status, and one of the most brilliant men that's ever lived, in the eyes of the secular humanist today, Bertrand Russell is alive. That woman is dead. And I want to tell you, if you understand what I'm driving at right now, in the eyes of Jesus, that woman is alive and Russell is dead. Jesus Christ continually contradicts you in the way you experience yourself as alive, and he compels you to radically redefine what you mean by life. He encountered you the way he encounters the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. That's why the Pascals, that's why the Augustines, that's why the Edwards, that's why all of the great thinkers, men like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Polycarp, Ignatius, Origen, you go back through history, some of the greatest minds that ever lived bent their knee to him. One of the most brilliant, eloquent men was a fellow called Malcolm Muggeridge. He who ruthlessly used his pen to attack Christendom, make a mockery and a shambles of Christianity, suddenly discovered Jesus, encountered Jesus, received Jesus, and then in one of his books he pens these words. We look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, wealth accumulated, wealth dispersed, revolutions and counter-revolutions, first one nation dominant and then another. Shakespeare says he has spoken of the rise and fall of the great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. He says, I look back upon my own fellow countrymen in England, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made them mighty shall yet make them mightier yet. I have heard a crazed, cracked Austrian proclaim to the world the establishment of a German Reich that would last 1,000 years. An Italian clown announced that he was going to stop and restart the calendar to coincide with his own assumption to power. A murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as a wiser than Solomon, more enlightened than Ashoka, more powerful there than Marcus Aurelius himself. I have seen America wealthier and in terms of military weaponry more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the Americans so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar and an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest, all in one lifetime, all gone with the wind. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades, now a forbidden name out there. America, haunted by fears of running out of the precious fluid that keep her motorways roaring and the smog settling. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, power of America, England in all of her glory. Where are they today? You tell me, where are they? Where are the Hitlers who are going to establish a Reich for a millennium? Where is Mussolini who is going to restart the calendar? Where are all these great murderous brigands who tried to dominate the world through power or ideology or whatever? All of these gone, and Muggeridge says, out of the discarded props of all of these civilizations, there stands the towering figure of Jesus with his counter perspective, that it is not in living, but it's dying. It's not in receiving, but it's in giving. It's not in being pardoned, but it's in pardoning. And somehow he reverses all of our values. And I am saying to you, this Jesus, for 2,000 years, has been the butt of ridicule of thousands of writers. They have not been able to dislodge him. The Bible is still the best-selling book in all the world. That Jesus can change your life. Thirdly, and very quickly, number 1, the essential nature of his person. Number 2, the definitive nature of his ministry. Number 3, the efficacious nature of his provision. How does he do this? Number 1, he ministers to me in my suffering. He ministers to me in my suffering. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to live long to know sooner or later you're going to contact suffering. I want you to look at the cross for a moment and tell me this. If you read the double-day publication of the Shroud of Turin, where many scholars, I'm not saying I agree with their conclusion, many scholars believe the Shroud of Turin is the shroud of Jesus. I'm not saying it is. What we do know about that shroud is that it was wrapped around a person who was crucified, nails in hands, nails in feet, a mark on the side and marks on the head. And when they tell you what crucifixion really was, it tells you that a Roman fellow called the lictor, who was trained in the art of persecution, muscles bound there with a huge whip, would come within approximate distance of the person to be scourged, and Jesus was scourged. They take the body, the clothes of the body of the individual to be scourged. His body was bent, tied into a stump of wood jutting out of the ground, wrists and ankles tied to that stump, and then the Roman lictor would pour that whip onto his body and peel out flesh and blood with every whipping. Matthew says by the time they'd finished scourging him and took him to the cross, he hardly had enough strength left. And he says this, they all sat there and watched him. And Jesus says in his word that for this very cause he came into the world, so that he could die for your sins and mine. Are you going to make a mockery of that and say, I don't believe it? Or by faith and the reason of the resurrection, are you going to respond and say, all right, preacher, that Jesus has spoken to me? His ministry to you through suffering. And I want to tell you some of the struggles I've been through, some of the physical disabilities I've picked up owing to the heavy onslaught of travel and the pressure within your body, and some of the loneliest moments I've been through. I can still say, if you gave me all the options in the world to be anything else, I wouldn't want it, because I know that deep within me lives this Christ, and I am completely at peace with gratitude with him within me. Which is my final thought. His ministry to you through suffering, his ministry in you through indwelling. His ministry in you through indwelling. You can ask me, Ravi, are you pure? And I say, no, sir, but somebody in me is. Ravi, are you compassionate? In many ways, no, but somebody in me is. Can you preach with power? No, but there's somebody in me who can. In other words, this Jesus comes within you and doesn't only change what you do, he changes what you want to do. In closing, I would like to read this for you. It's a sermon written by a fellow who entitled What Pilate Said to Gaius One Night. It's marvelous. I'm just going to take excerpts of this. So please listen as I read this to you. What Pilate said to Gaius one night, some years after the crucifixion, a writer using his imagination. It suddenly closed in on me, Gaius, the impact of how trapped I was. The proud arm of Rome, with all its boast of justice, was to be but a dirty dagger in the pudgy hands of the priests. I was waiting in the room, Gaius, I used for court, officially enthroned with cloak and guard, when they let this Jesus in. Well, Gaius, don't smile at this, as you value your jaw, but I've had no peace since the day he walked into my judgment hall. It's been years, Gaius, but those scenes I'll read from the back of my eyelids every night. You've seen Caesar, haven't you, when he was young, inspecting the legion. His arrogant manner was childlike compared to the manner of the Nazarene. He didn't have to strut, you see. He walked towards my throne, arms bound with a strident mastery, this Jesus did, and a kind of a control that by its very audacity silenced the room for an instant and left me trembling with an insane desire to stand up and salute. The clerk began reading the absurd list of charges, the priestly delegations punctuating these with the palm rubbings, the beard strokings, the eye rollings, and the pious gutturals, by now which I had learned to ignore. But I more felt it, Gaius, than heard it. I questioned him mechanically, and he answered very little. But what he said and the way he said it, it was as if his level gaze had pulled up my naked soul right up into my eyes and was probing it there. And a voice kept saying in my ears, "Why, you're on trial, Pilate," and that the man wasn't even listening to the charges. You'd have sworn he had just come in out of friendly interest to see what was going to happen to me. And the very pressure of his standing there had grown unbearable when a slave rushed in all a tremble, interrupting court, bringing a message from Claudia. She had stabbed at the stylus in that childish way that she does when she's distraught. "Don't judge this amazing man, Pilate," she wrote. "I was haunted in dreams by him this night." Gaius, I tried to free him. From that moment on, I tried, and I'll always think he knew it. I declared him out of my jurisdiction, being a Galilean, but the native King Herod discovered he was born in Judea and sent him right back to me. I appealed to the crowd, hoping that they would be his sympathizers, but Caiaphas had stationed agitators to whip up the beasts that cry for blood, and you know how in this town here, any citizen loves the blood of another person just after breakfast and screams for another's blood. I had him beaten, Gaius, a thorough barracks room beating. I'm still not sure why, to appease the crowd, I guess. But do we Romans really need any reason for beatings? Isn't that the code for anything we don't understand? Well, it didn't work, Gaius. The crowd roared like some slavering beast when I brought him back. If only you could have watched him. They had thrown some rags of mock purple over his pulped and bleeding shoulders. They had jammed a chaplet of thorns down on his forehead, and it fitted. It all fitted, Gaius. He stood there, watching them from my balcony, flamed from weakness by now, but royal, I tell you. Not just pain, but pity shining from his eyes. And I kept thinking somehow this is monstrous. This is upside down. That purple is real. That crown is real. And somehow these animal noises the crowd is shrieking should be praised. And then Caiaphas played his masterstroke on me. He announced there in public that this Jesus claimed a crown, and that was treason to Caesar. And the guards began to glance at one another quickly, and that mob of spineless filth began to shout, "Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar!" And Gaius, I knew I was beaten, and I gave the order. I couldn't look at him. Then I did a childish thing. I called for water. And there on the balcony, I washed my hands of that whole affair. But as they led him away, Gaius, I did look up, and he turned and looked at me. No smile, no pity, just glanced at my hands, and I'll feel the weight of his eyes on them from now on. But you're yawning, Gaius. I've kept you up. And the fact of the matter is you're in need of some rest and some holidays. Claudia will be asleep by now. Rows of lighted lamps line her couch. She can't sleep in the dark anymore. No, not since that afternoon. You see, Gaius, the sun went out when my guards executed him. That's exactly what I said. I don't know how, I don't know what. I only know that I was there. And though it was the middle of the day, it turned as black as the tunnels of hell in that miserable city. And while I tried to compose Claudia and explain how I'd been trapped, she railed at me with a dream, and she's had that dream ever since. When she sleeps in the dark, some form of it, that there was to have been a new Caesar, and that I, her husband, had killed him. Oh, we've been to Egypt, to their seers and magicians. We've listened by the hour to the oracles in the musty temples of Greece chattering their inanities. We've called it an oriental curse that we're under, and we've tried to break it 1,000 ways, Gaius, but there's no breaking it, except, and even that, it might not, you see. But you know why I've kept going, Gaius? Deeper than the curse is the haunting, driving certainty that he is still somewhere near, and that I have some unfinished business with him, and that now and then as I walk by the lake, he's following me. And much as that strikes terror, Gaius, I wonder if that isn't the only hope. You see, if I could walk up to him, and this time salute, and tell him that now I know that whoever else he is, he was the only man worthy of his name in all Judea that day. Tell him I know I wasn't trapped, that I trapped myself. Tell him here is one Roman who wishes he really were Caesar. I believe that would do it, Gaius, wouldn't it? I believe he'd listen and know I meant it, and at last I'd see him smile. Yes, quiet tonight. Not a breeze stirring, Gaius. Good night, you'd better run along. No. Would you please waken the slave outside the door and tell him to bring me my cloak, my heavy one, please? I believe I'll walk by the lake. Yes, it's dark there, Gaius, but I won't be alone. I really haven't ever been alone. Not since that day. Yes, good night, Gaius. The conscious water saw its master and blushed. You can hear all the sermons you want to hear. You can read all the books you want to read. You will never find out what we are talking about until you experience Jesus. If you don't know him, sir, if you don't know him, madam, would you take the courage and say, I'm willing to put my hand in his hand. I want him to live within me. Would you do that? I hope you will.